Instincts. Guy McAllister had spent a lifetime in the skies, navigating storms and turbulence. But today was different. The private jet carrying one of the most powerful CEOs in the business world, Marissa Langston, was spiraling out of control. Marissa, seated with her laptop still open, gripped the armrest as the plane jolted violently. Her perfectly tailored suit betrayed no signs of panic, but her trembling fingers gave her away. "Can't you do something?" she barked at Guy, her tone sharp despite the chaos. "Stay strapped in," Guy shouted back, his focus unwavering as he fought to stabilize the aircraft. The roaring of the engines was deafening, but nothing could drown out the pilot's voice was calm but firm, like a man who had seen worse and survived. Seconds later, a loud crunch echoed through the cabin as the plane hit the canopy of a dense forest before crashing onto the sand. The world went silent. When Marissa's eyes fluttered open, the first thing she noticed was the oppressive heat. The once pristine jet lay in ruins, smoke rising into the blue sky. Guy was already there, pulling her from the wreckage with surprising strength. His shirt was torn, his face smudged with dirt, but his piercing eyes demanded attention. "You're alive," he muttered, almost to himself. She struggled to stand, shaking off his hands. "Of course I'm alive," she snapped, brushing sand off her suit as though dignity could be salvaged. Her gaze scanned the desolate beach and endless ocean. "Where the hell are we?" Guy stepped back, letting her take in the scene. "Somewhere far from civilization," he said, "and without a working radio, we're not calling for help anytime soon." Her sharp breath and wide eyes betrayed her fear, but she masked it quickly. "This is unacceptable. Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yeah," he replied coolly, pulling supplies from the wreckage. "You're the woman who's going to help me survive. Start looking for anything we can use." Marissa froze, her glare icy. "You can't be serious. I don't do survival." Guy straightened, the tension thick between them. "You don't have a choice." For the first time in her life, Marissa Langston was powerless, and Guy McAllister, he was her only hope. The sun blazed mercilessly as the hours passed, and the reality of their situation began to sink in. Marissa sat on a fallen log, watching Guy rummage through the wreckage of the plane. His movements were methodical, every action deliberate. Meanwhile, her pristine suit now felt like a prison in the heat, her heels sinking into the soft sand with every step. "Why are you so calm?" she finally asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Guy didn't look up. "Panic wastes energy," he replied, holding up a crumpled water bottle. "And energy's something we'll need if we want to make it through the night." She crossed her arms, frustration boiling over. "So what's the plan, Mr. Pilot? Build a 5-star resort and wait for a rescue team to stroll in?" Guy turned to her, his expression unreadable. "The plan is survival, Ms. Langston, and you're not making it any easier with that attitude." Marissa scoffed but said nothing. For the first time, she noticed the cuts on his hands. The dirt streaked across his face. He had been working non-stop while she sat in the shade, waiting for a miracle. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Guy managed to create a small shelter using debris from the plane and branches from the nearby trees. It wasn't much, a lean-to barely big enough for the two of them, but it was something. Marissa wrinkled her nose as she surveyed the structure. "This is where we're supposed to sleep?" "It'll keep the rain off," Guy replied, already gathering wood for a fire. "You can thank me later." She didn't respond, but her silence said enough. For someone who had built an empire from the ground up, she now found herself completely out of her element. By the time the fire was crackling, the sky had turned a deep indigo. Guy handed her half of a protein bar he'd salvaged from the wreckage. She stared at it like it was an insult. "This is dinner?" "Unless you feel like fishing," he quipped, leaning back against a tree. She hesitated but eventually took a bite, grimacing at the bland taste. "How can you just sit there like this is normal?" He looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. "It's not normal," he admitted, "but losing your head won't help. Trust me, I've been through worse." Marissa raised an eyebrow. "Worse than crashing a plane on a deserted island?" Guy's jaw tightened and he stared into the flames. "You'd be surprised." For the first time that day, Marissa felt a flicker of something she didn't expect. Curiosity. There was more to this man than the calm, collected pilot she'd met just hours ago. As the night deepened, the firelight danced across their faces. Marissa wrapped her arms around herself, the unfamiliar sound of waves crashing against the shore filling the silence. "Do you think they'll find us?" she asked quietly. Guy glanced at her, his voice steady but not unkind. "Not if we don't find a way to help them. For now, we focus on staying alive." She nodded, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. For the first time in years, Marissa Langston wasn't in control, and strangely enough, she wasn't entirely sure how she felt about that. The morning sun pierced through the gaps in the makeshift shelter, pulling Marissa from an uneasy sleep. The distant sound of waves and the chirping of unseen birds felt surreal, almost mocking. She sat up, her muscles stiff from the uncomfortable night. Guy was already outside, crouched by the fire pit, sharpening a piece of metal salvaged from the wreckage. "Good morning to you, too," she muttered, brushing sand off her wrinkled clothes. "Sleep well?" Guy asked without looking up. She glared at him. "If you consider lying on a pile of sand and sticks sleeping, then sure." He smirked faintly but didn't respond. His focus remained on the jagged piece of metal in his hands. "What are you doing now?" she asked, walking over despite herself. "Making a spear," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "A spear?" She raised an eyebrow. "What are we, cavemen?" "Unless you'd rather starve," he said, testing the point of the improvised weapon. "This is our best bet for catching food." Marissa folded her arms. "I'm a CEO, not a hunter. I negotiate deals. I don't wrestle fish." Guy finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Out here, it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. You either adapt or you don't make it." His words stung, but she knew he was right. Still, she couldn't bring herself to admit it. Instead, she turned and walked toward the shore, letting the cool ocean breeze wash over her frustration. By midday, they had established a fragile rhythm. Guy worked tirelessly, foraging for materials and testing his spear in the shallows, while Marissa begrudgingly collected driftwood and inspected the wreckage for anything useful. She hated every second of it, but knew complaining wouldn't change their situation. At one point, she slipped on a rock while carrying a pile of wood, falling hard onto her knees. The sting of embarrassment burned as much as the scrape on her leg. "Careful," Guy said, appearing beside her as if out of nowhere. "I don't need your help," she snapped, pulling away as he offered a hand. He didn't argue, stepping back to let her regain her composure, but his silence felt heavier than any words. Later that evening, they sat by the fire again, eating bits of charred fish Guy had managed to catch. It wasn't much, but it was better than the protein bars. Marissa watched him as he ate, the firelight casting shadows across his sharp features. "How do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Do what?" "Keep going. Stay so calm." He paused, the flicker of a memory crossing his face. "Because I've been in situations where losing my head meant losing everything." She hesitated, curiosity and vulnerability warring within her. "Like what?" Guy's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought he might actually answer. But then he looked away, the walls going back up. "Another time," he said simply. The crackle of the fire filled the silence as Marissa sat back, staring at the stars above. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. But for the first time, she also felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just survival anymore. There was something about Guy, his calm strength, his unshakable focus, that made her want to understand him. She just wasn't sure if she was ready to try. Days passed on the deserted island, each one blending into the next. The rhythm of survival became their unspoken truce. Guy's quiet competence and Marissa's reluctant willingness to adapt created an uneasy partnership. They weren't friends, not yet, but the initial hostility between them had softened into something more tolerable. Marissa sat by the fire one evening, watching Guy as he meticulously worked on reinforcing their shelter. His hands, rough from years of flying and now survival, moved with precision. She'd been studying him for days, noticing the small details, the way he instinctively scanned the horizon, the quiet determination in his actions. "You're like a machine," she said finally, breaking the silence. Guy glanced at her, his expression neutral. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You don't stop. You don't complain. You just do." He shrugged, returning to his work. Complaining doesn't solve anything. She frowned, poking at the fire with a stick. Do you ever let yourself feel anything? Or is this stoic act just part of your charm? He stopped, his shoulders tensing for the briefest moment. Then he turned to her, his eyes sharper than usual. You think this is an act? Marissa hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden shift in his tone. I don't know, she admitted. There's more to you, isn't there? You're not just some small-time pilot. Guy sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. The flames danced between them, their shadows flickering on the sand. You want to know about me? He asked, his voice low. She nodded, leaning forward slightly. Yeah, I do. He stared into the fire, the silence stretching so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice distant. I was in the military, search and rescue, spent years pulling people out of impossible situations. Marissa blinked, surprised. That explains a lot. Maybe, he said, his gaze still fixed on the fire, but it doesn't explain everything. She tilted her head, curiosity sparking. What do you mean? Guy hesitated, then shook his head. Another time. Frustration flared in her chest. You keep saying that. Another time. When is that, exactly? When we're rescued. When we're back to our normal lives. What if that never happens? Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Guy looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. Why does it matter so much to you? He asked quietly. Because I'm trying to figure out how you do it, she admitted, her voice softer now. How you stay so strong when everything's falling apart. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he leaned back, his expression softening just slightly. I don't feel strong, he admitted. Most days, I feel like I'm just holding on. His honesty caught her off guard, and for the first time, she saw the cracks in his armor. The weight of his past, the burden he carried, it was all there, just beneath the surface. Marissa looked down at her hands, her own walls beginning to crumble. I built my entire life on control, she said quietly, on being the one who always had the answers. But out here, none of that matters, does it? Guy's gaze softened as he studied her. Out here, we survive, he said simply, and we do it together. For the first time since the crash, Marissa felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Trust. The fire crackled between them, the night air heavy with unspoken truths. They didn't say anything else, but they didn't need to. Somehow, in the middle of nowhere, two strangers had found the beginnings of something neither of them expected. The sky turned an ominous shade of gray by mid-afternoon, clouds churning like a boiling cauldron. The air grew heavy, charged with a restless energy that set both Guy and Marissa on edge. A storm's coming, Guy said, his voice tense as he looked out over the ocean. Marissa followed his gaze, her stomach tightening. How bad do you think it'll be? Bad enough, he muttered, already moving toward their shelter. We need to secure everything. The hours that followed were a frenzy of preparation. Guy reinforced the fragile structure, while Marissa gathered anything that might be swept away by the wind. The tension between them had all but evaporated, replaced by a silent determination to weather the coming storm. By the time the first drops of rain fell, the wind had already begun to howl, whipping through the trees like a living thing. The flimsy shelter creaked under the strain as they huddled inside, their bodies pressed close for warmth and stability. The storm hit with a vengeance. Sheets of rain pounded the ground, turning the sand to mud. Thunder roared overhead, each crack louder than the last, and the wind threatened to tear their shelter apart. Marissa clung to a support beam, her heart racing. What if this doesn't hold? She shouted over the noise. Guy's jaw tightened as he braced against the shaking structure. Then we find another way, he said, his voice firm despite the chaos around them. A deafening crack split the air as a nearby tree was struck by lightning, sending splinters flying. Marissa screamed, burying her face against Guy's shoulder. For a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. It's okay, Guy said, his voice softer now, reassuring. I've got you. The words shouldn't have meant anything, but in that moment, they were everything. She clung to him, his steady presence the only thing grounding her in the storm. Hours passed like an eternity, but eventually the winds began to die down, the rain tapering off into a gentle drizzle. When the storm finally passed, the island was unrecognizable. Trees had been uprooted, their shelter reduced to a pile of debris. Marissa stepped outside, her legs unsteady as she surveyed the destruction. "Everything's gone," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Not everything," Guy said, joining her. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. There was no hint of despair in his expression, only quiet determination. "How do you keep doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How do you keep going when everything falls apart?" Guy looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because giving up isn't an option. Not for me. Not for us." His words struck a chord deep within her. For so long, she had relied on herself, building walls to keep everyone else out. But now, standing in the aftermath of the storm, she realized she didn't have to do it alone. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the ravaged landscape, Marissa felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she saw Guy not just as a survivor, but as a partner, someone she could rely on, even in the worst of circumstances. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. The days after the storm marked a turning point. The destruction had forced them to rebuild not just their shelter, but their dynamic. The island, once a prison, now became a strange sanctuary, a place where walls, both physical and emotional, had crumbled. Guy and Marissa worked side by side, salvaging what they could from the wreckage and starting anew. The silence between them was no longer tense or uncomfortable. Instead, it was filled with a quiet understanding, an unspoken bond forged in adversity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they sat on the beach. Guy had fashioned a fishing net out of vines, and Marissa had managed to catch rainwater in hollowed-out coconuts. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a life they had built together. Marissa broke the silence first, her voice soft. "You know, I used to think I had it all figured out. My career, my life, everything was under my control." She paused, looking down at her hands. "But out here, none of that matters. Titles, money, power, they're useless." Guy nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's funny, isn't it? You spend your whole life chasing things you think are important, only to realize they're not what you need." She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "What do you need, Guy?" He hesitated, the question hanging in the air. Then he met her eyes, his voice steady. "I need purpose. I need connection. And I need to know that when it all falls apart, I can still hold on to something real." Her heart ached at the vulnerability in his words. "You've been holding on to me," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess I have." The weight of his admission settled between them, heavy and electric. Marissa felt her pulse quicken, the air between them charged with something neither of them had dared to name. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" "For saving me," she said, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Not just in the crash, but everything after. I wouldn't have made it without you." Guy's hand closed around hers, his grip firm yet gentle. "You saved yourself, Marissa. I just helped you see it." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the two of them sat in silence, their hands intertwined. For the first time in years, Marissa felt something she thought she'd lost. Peace. The sound of a distant engine shattered the quiet. Both of them shot to their feet, scanning the horizon. A small plane was approaching, its lights blinking like beacons of hope. "Is it real?" Marissa asked, her voice trembling. Guy nodded, a grin breaking across his face. "It's real." They waved frantically, using a makeshift flag Guy had prepared for such an occasion. The plane dipped lower, signaling that they had been spotted. Relief washed over them, followed by a bittersweet realization. Their time on the island was coming to an end. As the rescue plane landed on the beach, Marissa turned to Guy. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. He smiled, his eyes warm. "We go back, but we don't forget." She nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper. "I'm not sure I want to forget." Neither of them said it outright, but they both knew. What had started as a tragedy had turned into something unexpected, something worth holding on to. As they boarded the rescue plane, Marissa glanced back at the island one last time. It had taken everything from her and given her more than she ever thought possible. And as she sat beside Guy, their hands brushing once more, she realized that some beginnings are born from the unlikeliest of endings.